Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life Story 999, where we dive into stories that inspire justice, courage, and humanity. Today, we're sharing a story about injustice and the fight for what's right, something that could happen to any one of us. As you listen, think about what you would do if faced with this kind of situation. Please remember to like, comment, and share your thoughts or even your own stories in the comments below. Now, let's get started. On a frigid Monday morning, the courthouse stood stark against the winter sky. Its marble steps were worn from years of footsteps, and today, they would lead to a case that would change the lives of everyone involved. Mary Thompson, a 40-year-old mother of three, walked up those steps, her hands trembling, but her chin held high. She had been in county jail for 3 months, waiting for this day, all over a small bottle of prescription pills found in her car, medication that belonged to her elderly mother. Inside courtroom 5C, Mary sat straight-backed in her chair, wearing her best dress, the one she saved for church on Sundays. Judge Henry Wallace entered the courtroom promptly at 9 a.m., his black robe flowing behind him like a shadow. Judge Wallace had built a reputation over his 20 years as a tough but fair judge, though some whispered about his unusually harsh sentences for people of color. This day would test just how fair he really was. The prosecutor presented the case, a simple possession charge, with no intent to distribute. This type of case usually ended in probation, but Judge Wallace seemed unimpressed with Mary's story. Her court-appointed lawyer explained how Mary had been caring for her ailing mother, how she worked 2 jobs to keep her children fed, and how those pills were simply her mother's heart medication. He pleaded for leniency, reminding the judge of Mary's clean record and her importance to her children. Michael, 15, Lisa, 12, and Sam, 9. Mary stood, her voice calm but clear. "Your Honor, I know I made a mistake, but my children need me. I will never be in this courtroom again, I promise." But her plea fell on deaf ears. Judge Wallace leaned back, his gaze cold and unwavering. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, "your circumstances are unfortunate, but the law is the law. Too many times, this court has heard stories like yours, and too often, we are asked to look the other way. Today, we will not." Mary's lawyer tried to interject, "Your Honor, given her clean record and the nature of the offense." "Enough," Judge Wallace cut him off. "The law must be respected, and consequences must be faced. We cannot afford to show leniency to every individual who stands here with a story. This court will make an example of those who believe they are above the law." He paused for a long moment, as if savoring the tension in the air. The gavel hit the sound block, echoing through the cold, silent courtroom. "The defendant will remain in custody pending sentencing." Mary's face went pale, and her hands started to shake. Her lawyer placed a reassuring hand on her arm, whispering something meant to comfort her, but Mary barely heard it. All she could think of was her children waiting at home, wondering why their mother wasn't there. As the bailiff approached to escort her away, Mary turned to her lawyer, her eyes wide with fear. "Please, make sure someone calls my kids," she whispered, her voice breaking. "They're expecting me to pick them up today." The courtroom remained silent as Mary was led away, the heavy door closing behind her with a hollow thud. Judge Wallace didn't look back, already preparing for the next case, his demeanor cold and detached. But for Mary and her family, this was only the beginning of a fight they never thought they would face. Thank you for joining us today as we explore this emotional journey. Stay with us to see what happens next and how Mary's story unfolds. Please share your thoughts below. What would you do in Mary's situation? And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that touch our hearts and inspire change. Judge Wallace leaned back in his chair, removing his glasses to clean them slowly, as if savoring the gravity of the moment. He looked down at Mary, his cold blue eyes devoid of sympathy. "This court has heard too many excuses," he said, his voice echoing in the stillness of the courtroom. "The law must be upheld and examples must be made." He paused, letting the tension build before delivering the shocking words that would change Mary's life forever. "I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. A collective gasp swept through the courtroom. Mary felt the air leave her lungs, her knees weakening as the weight of the sentence sank in. Her lawyer, visibly stunned, scrambled to his feet, his voice tight with urgency. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The sentencing guidelines for this offense." "Silence!" Judge Wallace barked, banging his gavel so hard it seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. "One more word, and you'll be held in contempt of court." The judge's eyes bore into Mary's lawyer, silencing any further protest. Mary's eyes welled with tears, her entire body trembling. She turned to look at her lawyer, who was now slumped in his chair, his face flushed with frustration and helplessness. The bailiff approached her, and she felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around her wrists. Her knees finally gave way, and she sank to the floor, her tears flowing freely now. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "someone call my children's school. They're waiting for me." The courtroom was silent, the onlookers frozen in shock. Even the prosecutor, who had argued the case, looked uncomfortable, shuffling papers as though trying to disappear into his seat. Mary's sobs filled the empty space left by the judge's words, a heartbreaking sound that seemed to linger in the cold, indifferent air. Judge Wallace rose from his seat, his robe flowing behind him as he turned and walked out of the courtroom, never once looking back at the devastation he had caused. To him, this was just another case, another defendant who needed to be taught a lesson. He disappeared through the door to his chambers, leaving behind a room filled with disbelief and sorrow. Mary was helped to her feet by the bailiff, her legs feeling as if they might buckle under her at any moment. The few spectators in the room exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others looking down in shame at what they had just witnessed. Mary's lawyer reached out, his voice breaking as he spoke. "I'll appeal this, Mary. We won't give up." But his words felt empty, a weak promise against the overwhelming tide of injustice that had swept over her. As Mary was led away, her face streaked with tears, she turned once more to look at the courtroom, the place that had taken her freedom. She thought of her children, waiting for her at school, and the way their faces would fall when they learned she wasn't coming home. She had promised them she would be back today. That promise now felt like a cruel joke, a dream shattered by the gavel's heavy blow. The heavy door closed behind Mary with a resounding thud, sealing her fate for now. The courtroom slowly began to empty, the weight of what had just happened pressing heavily on everyone present. No one could deny the injustice that had unfolded, but the reality of it left them silent, unsure of what to do next. Outside the courthouse, the sky was gray, the winter chill biting at the skin of those who left the building. For Mary, the world had suddenly turned much colder, and the path ahead seemed impossible. But little did she know, this was just the beginning of a battle she and her family would fight with every ounce of strength they had. Thank you for staying with us as Mary's story unfolds. Remember to like, comment, and share this story to help shed light on injustices that happen every day. What would you do if you were in Mary's shoes? Let us know your thoughts, and stay tuned for the next part of this powerful journey. Miles away, Mayor John Mitchell sat at his desk in City Hall, reviewing proposals for a new community center. His office was filled with the warm afternoon sunlight, a rare moment of calm in his otherwise hectic schedule. His secretary's voice broke through the intercom, her tone urgent. "Mr. Mayor, you need to see this. Channel 7 is running a breaking news story about a sentencing downtown." John furrowed his brow, sensing the anxiety in her voice. He picked up the remote from his desk, turning on the TV mounted on the wall. What he saw made his heart drop. His wife's face appeared on the screen, her eyes wide with fear as she was led away in handcuffs. The news ticker read, "Mother of 3 sentenced to life for minor drug offense." His coffee cup slipped from his grasp, shattering on the floor. The room seemed to spin as he stared at the screen. Mary. His Mary. Few knew that Mary Thompson was actually Mary Mitchell, his wife of 18 years. They had kept their marriage private to protect their children from the relentless scrutiny that came with being in the public eye. He hadn't even known she had been arrested. Mary must have kept it from him, trying to shield his career, trying to spare him the distraction. John's mind raced. How could this happen? How had he not known? He took a deep breath, the air feeling heavy in his lungs. He forced himself to focus, his instincts kicking in. He picked up the phone, his hand trembling slightly. "Cancel all my meetings for the day," he ordered his assistant. "And get me District Attorney Rachel Chun on the line immediately." As he waited, he looked over at the family photo on his desk. Mary, Michael, Lisa, and Sam, all smiling by the lake. He remembered that day vividly. How Mary had laughed when Sam splashed her with water. How she had pulled John into the lake fully clothed, the children giggling around them. It was one of their happiest days, a reminder of everything that mattered to him. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let Mary face this alone. Rachel picked up after a few rings. "John, what's going on?" she asked, her voice tinged with confusion. "It's Mary," John said, his voice breaking. "She's been sentenced to life." "Rachel, I had no idea. She must have kept it from me. I need your help. We need to appeal this, and we need to do it fast." Rachel paused, stunned. "Mary? Your wife?" There was a beat of silence as the weight of what John had said sank in. "John, I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Neither did I," he whispered. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city below, the people going about their lives, unaware of the chaos that had just erupted in his own. "Rachel, Judge Wallace has gone too far this time. This isn't justice, it's a travesty. I need you to do whatever it takes to fix this." "Of course," Rachel said, her voice resolute. "I'll start gathering everything we need. I won't let this stand." John hung up, his hand lingering on the receiver as he tried to gather his thoughts. He turned back to his desk, his eyes catching on the shattered remains of his coffee cup. The dark liquid was seeping into the carpet, a growing stain that seemed to mirror the darkness spreading in his heart. He bent down to pick up the pieces, his hands shaking slightly. He had to stay strong. For Mary, for their children. He straightened, drawing in a deep breath. He knew the risks involved in making their marriage public, the scrutiny it would bring. But what choice did he have now? He wouldn't let Mary suffer for a mistake that didn't deserve punishment, much less a life sentence. He picked up the phone again, this time calling his chief of staff. "Tom, I need you to prepare a statement. We're going public with this. Mary is my wife, and I'm not going to let this happen without a fight." Tom hesitated for a moment on the other end of the line. "Are you sure, John? This is going to be huge. Once we do this, there's no turning back." "I'm sure," John said, his voice steady. "My family comes first. Always." He hung up and turned back to the TV, where the news anchors were still discussing Mary's case. The footage replayed over and over. Mary, her hands cuffed, her face streaked with tears. He clenched his jaw, a fire igniting in his chest. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He took one last look at the photo on his desk, his family smiling up at him, and whispered to himself, "I'll bring you home, Mary, no matter what it takes." Thank you for following along as we delve deeper into this powerful story. Stay with us to see how Mayor Mitchell will fight for justice and for his family. Please like, comment, and share your thoughts below. What would you do if someone you loved faced such an unjust situation? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and spark change. Rachel Chin, the district attorney, answered the mayor's call, stunned when John revealed that Mary was his wife. "We need to fix this, Rachel," John said, his voice breaking. "Wallace's bias has gone unchecked for too long." Rachel promised to help, and that very night, she gathered her team at her office. They combed through old case files, determined to uncover a pattern in Judge Wallace's sentencing history. What they found was damning, an unmistakable pattern of racial discrimination. Minority defendants were regularly receiving sentences 3 to 4 times longer than white defendants for similar offenses. As Rachel reviewed the files, her anger grew. It wasn't just about Mary. It was about every person who had stood before Judge Wallace and faced the weight of his unjust decisions. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. Rachel and her team uncovered documents from Wallace's early career that painted an even bleaker picture. Records showed ties to discriminatory organizations, affiliations that revealed Wallace's deeply ingrained biases. He had written legal opinions supporting policies that many considered outdated and unjust even in those years. The more they unearthed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just one bad ruling. Wallace's entire career was riddled with prejudice. By midnight, Rachel's desk was covered in stacks of files, each one representing a life that had been affected by Wallace's bias. She rubbed her tired eyes and looked around at her team. They were exhausted, but the fire in their eyes told her that they weren't giving up. "We're going to bring this to light," she said, her voice strong despite her fatigue. "We have to. Not just for Mary, but for everyone who has been wronged." Meanwhile, John was at home, staring at the phone, waiting for updates. The house was quiet, too quiet. His children had been taken to his sister's house for the night, away from the media storm that had already begun to brew. He knew that going public about Mary being his wife was going to put their family under a spotlight like never before. But he also knew that Mary's life depended on it. He picked up the framed family photo from his desk. Mary's smile was bright, her eyes filled with warmth and love. He closed his eyes, remembering the nights they'd spent talking about their future, the life they'd built together, and the promise they made to always protect their children. He had failed her by not knowing what she was going through, but he wouldn't fail her now. He picked up his phone and began drafting a statement. The world needed to know what kind of man Judge Wallace really was. The next morning, Rachel called John, her voice tense but determined. "John, we have enough. Wallace's record is full of discrepancies. We found multiple cases where his sentencing clearly deviated from state guidelines, always against people of color. This is bigger than just Mary." John felt a flicker of hope. "What do we do next?" he asked. "I'm filing an emergency appeal," Rachel replied, "and I think it's time for a press conference. We need the public on our side. If they know the truth, it will put pressure on the judicial system to act." John nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I agree. Let's do it. I'll call the press, and we'll make this public. It's time people knew who Judge Wallace really is." Later that afternoon, John stood in front of City Hall. Dozens of reporters gathered before him. Cameras flashed, and the murmur of the crowd filled the air. He took a deep breath, then stepped up to the podium. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I stand before you today not just as your mayor, but as a husband and a father. Yesterday, my wife, Mary Mitchell, known to many of you as Mary Thompson, was sentenced to life in prison for a minor offense. This was not justice. It was a miscarriage of justice, rooted in bias and discrimination." The crowd murmured, the surprise evident. John continued, "Judge Wallace has a long history of disproportionately harsh sentences against minorities. We have evidence of his bias, evidence that has gone unchecked for too long. Today, we are calling for an immediate review of Judge Wallace's past cases and an appeal for Mary's sentence. This fight is not just for my wife, but for every individual who has been unjustly treated by our judicial system." Rachel watched from the side, her heart pounding. She knew this was risky, but it was necessary. She could already see the reporters scrambling, the news starting to spread. This was just the beginning, but it was a start. And sometimes, a start was all they needed. As John finished his statement, he looked out at the crowd, his eyes locking onto the cameras. "I won't stop until Mary is home with our children. I won't stop until Judge Wallace is held accountable. And I won't stop until justice is truly served." The reporters shouted questions, but John turned and walked away, his heart pounding. He knew this was just the first step in a long battle, but he was ready for it. For Mary, for their children, and for everyone who had been wronged by an unjust system. Thank you for staying with us as we continue this story. If you believe in fighting for justice, please like, share, and comment. What would you do if someone you loved faced such injustice? Stay tuned as we continue to follow John, Rachel, and Mary's fight to uncover the truth and bring justice where it's long overdue. The next afternoon, Mayor John Mitchell stood at the podium in City Hall, facing dozens of reporters. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Good evening," he began, his voice trembling but resolute. "I stand before you today not just as your mayor, but as a husband and a father. The woman sentenced yesterday, Mary Thompson, is my wife." The room erupted in gasps and a barrage of questions. The reporters surged forward, cameras clicking and pens scratching frantically on notepads. John raised his hand, his eyes stern, motioning for silence. "For 18 years, we have kept our marriage private to protect our children from public scrutiny," he continued. "But now, I must share this truth to expose a greater injustice. Judge Wallace's sentencing of my wife was not just unfair. It was part of a pattern of discrimination that has gone unchecked for far too long. John paused, holding up a framed family photo for everyone to see. Mary's warm smile and the joyful faces of their 3 children stared back at the gathered crowd. Mary is not just a defendant. She is a loving mother and a dedicated wife. She was carrying her mother's heart medication, something that should have never led to such a harsh and cruel punishment. This is not justice, he said, his voice growing stronger. This is an abuse of power, and it must end. The room fell silent, captivated by his words. John could feel the weight of the moment, the shift as people began to understand the gravity of what had happened. He set the photo down gently on the podium and continued. I am calling for a full review of Judge Wallace's past cases. We have uncovered a disturbing pattern of bias in his rulings, evidence that suggests Mary is not the only one who has suffered at his hands. We need immediate reforms to the sentencing guidelines to ensure that no one else endures the kind of injustice my wife has. John took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room, locking onto the cameras, knowing this would be broadcast across the state, maybe even the country. We cannot allow those in positions of power to wield their authority unjustly, especially against those who are vulnerable. This fight is not just for my wife. It is for every person who has faced an unjust system, who has been silenced and overlooked. We must demand accountability. Reporters began shouting questions, their voices blending into a cacophony of confusion. John remained still, his hand once again raised for silence. I know there will be questions, and I am prepared to answer them. But let me make one thing clear. Mary's case is just the beginning. We will fight this injustice in court, and we will fight it publicly. We will not rest until Judge Wallace is held accountable for his actions, and until my wife is home where she belongs. John's gaze shifted to the crowd, and for a moment, his eyes softened as he thought of his children, Michael, Lisa, and Sam, waiting anxiously for their mother's return. My children deserve their mother. Mary deserves her freedom. And our community deserves a justice system that truly serves all of us equally. Rachel Chen stood to the side, her heart pounding as she watched John speak. She could see the shift in the room. The reporters scribbling notes, the cameramen zooming in, the expressions of those watching changing from curiosity to empathy and outrage. She knew this was just the beginning, but it was the start they needed. John stepped away from the podium, ignoring the shouted questions from the reporters as they tried to follow him. He walked purposefully, his heart heavy but determined. This was only the first step in a long battle, but it was one he was willing to fight with everything he had. For Mary, for their children, and for every family that had ever been torn apart by injustice. Thank you for following along as we share this powerful journey. If you believe in fighting for what's right, please like, share, and comment below. How would you stand up for your loved ones in the face of injustice? Stay with us as we continue this story, and don't forget to subscribe for more updates as John, Rachel, and Mary fight for justice and change. The announcement spread quickly, and by the next morning, people gathered outside the courthouse in protest. Community leaders, activists, neighbors, and even strangers who had heard Mary's story on the news came together, demanding justice. Reverend Samuel Green, a respected leader in the community, stood before the crowd, his voice carrying across the square. This is not just about Mary. This is about every mother, every father, every family that has faced injustice in silence, he declared, his words ringing with passion. Mary's children, Michael, Lisa, and Sam, stood among the protesters, holding signs that read, "Bring our mom home." Their faces were filled with determination, a stark reflection of their father's strength. The sight of the 3 children standing bravely in the crowd touched the hearts of those gathered, reminding everyone that this was about more than just legalities. It was about a family torn apart. Local businesses began to show their support. The nearby bakery brought trays of fresh bread, while a local restaurant provided hot coffee and sandwiches to the protesters. Volunteers handed out bottled water and blankets as the cold day turned into an even colder night. Despite the chill in the air, the sense of warmth and unity among the crowd was palpable. People who had never met before were now standing shoulder to shoulder, united for a common cause. As night fell, the protest transformed into a candlelight vigil. Thousands of small flames flickered in the dark, their light reflecting off the courthouse steps. The crowd sang softly, voices blending together in a hymn of hope and resilience. Reverend Green led them in prayer, his deep voice resonating as he called for justice and strength for Mary and her family. The vigil was not just a protest. It was a symbol of solidarity, a declaration that they would not rest until justice was served. Inside the county jail, Mary sat on her bunk, watching the news coverage on the small television in the common area. She could hardly believe her eyes as she saw her children's faces on the screen, their signs held high. Tears streamed down her face, her heart swelling with both pride and pain. She knew she wasn't alone. Her family was out there fighting for her, and now, it seemed, the whole community was too. She wiped her tears, trying to steady herself. The other women in the cell block watched the news alongside her, some nodding in silent support. One of them, a woman named Carla, touched Mary's arm gently. "You've got a lot of people out there who care about you," she said softly. Mary nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "I just want to go home to my kids," she whispered. Back outside the courthouse, Rachel Chen stood on the edge of the crowd, her heart swelling as she took in the sight before her. She had spent countless nights poring over case files, searching for evidence of Wallace's bias. But this was what real change looked like. People coming together, refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. She pulled out her phone and took a photo of the scene, knowing she would need this reminder in the battle still to come. John stood near the courthouse steps, his eyes scanning the crowd. He felt a mixture of pride and hope that he hadn't felt in weeks. The community had answered his call for justice, and now they were standing together, demanding it. He walked over to where his children were standing, kneeling down to hug them. "We're going to bring Mom home," he said, his voice filled with conviction. "We're not giving up." The night wore on, but the crowd remained, their candles a testament to their resolve. They knew this was only the beginning, but they were ready for the long fight ahead. As the vigil continued, more people arrived. Friends, neighbors, even those who had never met Mary but believed in her cause. They brought more candles, more blankets, and most importantly, more voices. The message was clear. Mary was not alone, and neither was her family. This community, once divided by their daily struggles, was now united in their fight for justice. And they would not stop until Mary was free. Thank you for being part of this journey. If you believe in the power of community and standing up for what's right, please like, share, and comment below. Have you ever witnessed a community come together for justice? Share your story with us, and stay tuned as we continue to follow Mary's fight for freedom. A week later, the state appeals court convened to hear Mary's case. The courthouse was packed, the tension in the air almost palpable. Civil rights attorney Benjamin Carter stood tall before the bench, his voice calm but resolute. "Your Honors," he began, "Judge Wallace's actions were not just an error in judgment. They were a violation of justice, driven by bias." The gallery behind him was filled with supporters, Mary's family, neighbors, community leaders, and even former defendants who had faced Wallace's harsh sentences. Reverend Green sat in the front row, his eyes fixed on Benjamin as he spoke, silently praying for a breakthrough. Mary's children sat between John and Rachel, their small hands clutching each other's for comfort. They had been through so much, but they held on to hope that today would bring them one step closer to having their mother home. Benjamin presented the evidence that Rachel had gathered, statistics, testimonies, and documents that painted a clear picture of Judge Wallace's discriminatory behavior over the years. "The data doesn't lie," he said, his voice unwavering. Minority defendants under Judge Wallace's jurisdiction were given sentences 3 to 4 times longer than their white counterparts for the same offenses. This is not justice. This is prejudice disguised as law. The 3 appeals court judges listened intently, their expressions serious as they reviewed the documents and charts that Benjamin provided. Judge Maria Rodriguez, known for her fair and meticulous approach, leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. Judge Thomas Green took notes, while Judge Evelyn Marks looked over the testimonies, her eyes occasionally flicking up to the gallery, where the weight of the community's hope rested. The testimonies were powerful. Former defendants described their experiences with Judge Wallace, how they had felt belittled, unheard, and unfairly judged. One man, a father of two, spoke of how a minor offense had cost him years of his life, time away from his children that he could never get back. Another woman, her voice breaking, told of how Wallace had dismissed her pleas for leniency without a second thought, despite her being the sole caregiver for her elderly mother. The judges listened, the atmosphere in the courtroom thick with emotion. Hours passed, and Benjamin wrapped up his argument with a final plea. Your Honors, this is not just about Mary Thompson. This is about restoring faith in our justice system. It is about ensuring that every person, regardless of their background, is treated fairly under the law. Judge Wallace's actions have undermined that trust, and today, you have the power to begin to correct this injustice. The judges retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in a tense silence. Mary's children looked up at their father, their eyes filled with questions he couldn't yet answer. John held them close, whispering words of reassurance even as his own heart pounded with anxiety. The minutes felt like hours, the weight of what was at stake pressing down on everyone present. Finally, the doors to the judges' chambers opened, and the judges returned to their seats. The head judge, Maria Rodriguez, cleared her throat, the entire courtroom holding its breath. We have reviewed the evidence presented, she began, her voice steady. It is clear to this court that the sentence given to Mary Thompson was unjust and influenced by prejudice. We hereby vacate her sentence and order her immediate release. The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before the courtroom erupted in applause. Mary's children cried out in joy, their faces lighting up as tears of relief streamed down their cheeks. John pulled them close, his own tears falling freely as he looked over at Mary, who stood in stunned silence, her hand covering her mouth. Rachel reached over and squeezed Mary's shoulder, her own eyes misty. "You're going home," she whispered. Mary turned to her, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Thank you. Thank you for not giving up on me." As the applause continued, Mary was finally free. Free to hold her children, to return to her family, to rebuild the life that had been unjustly taken from her. And as she walked out of the courtroom, surrounded by her family and the community that had fought so hard for her, she knew that this was not just her victory. It was a victory for everyone who had ever faced injustice and a reminder that, together, they could make a difference. Thank you for being with us through this journey. If you believe in the power of fighting for justice, please like, share, and comment below. What are your thoughts on standing up against injustice? Let us know, and stay tuned as we continue to follow Mary's journey of healing and hope. Mary walked out of the county jail into the sunlight, her heart pounding with disbelief and joy. She had spent what felt like an eternity within those walls, but now, freedom was finally hers. Her family rushed forward to meet her, and Michael, Lisa, and Sam clung to her, their tears mixing with smiles. John joined them, wrapping his arms around all of them in a tight embrace. "We did it," he whispered, his own voice cracking with emotion. Tears glistened in his eyes as he held Mary close. Mary looked at her children, their faces filled with hope and happiness. She kissed each of them on the forehead, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I'm never letting you go again," she whispered, her voice filled with both determination and love. It was a moment of reunion, a moment that erased months of heartache with its warmth. The world around them seemed to fade away, and for those precious seconds, all that mattered was that they were together again. But Mary and John both knew that the fight wasn't over. What they had faced was a symptom of a much larger problem, one that required change far beyond the walls of their home. As they left the courthouse, Mary turned to John, her eyes filled with purpose. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else," she said. John nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Together, they decided to use their experience to push for broader change. With Rachel by their side, they launched the Justice Reform Initiative, a movement dedicated to reviewing and correcting unjust sentences across the state. They held press conferences, rallied support, and spoke to lawmakers. They made it their mission to shine a light on the injustices that had been ignored for too long. It didn't take long for their efforts to gain traction. The community that had supported Mary now stood behind the initiative, and soon, their work began to gain national attention. They were no longer just fighting for Mary. They were fighting for every person who had been wronged by an unjust system. Mary also returned to her community, determined to give back and to help others who had faced similar struggles. She spoke at churches, schools, and community centers, sharing her story and encouraging others to fight for what was right. Her words carried the weight of her experiences, and her passion was undeniable. People listened, inspired by her resilience and strength. She told them about the nights she had spent in jail, thinking of her children, and about the hope she had held onto because she knew her family and her community were fighting for her. "Never give up," she would say. "No matter how dark it gets, there is always hope." John, too, found himself transformed by their ordeal. He worked tirelessly alongside Rachel and other activists, using his position as mayor to push for legal reforms that would protect the rights of all citizens, especially those most vulnerable. He held meetings with state legislators, advocating for changes in sentencing guidelines and increased accountability for judges like Wallace. He wanted to ensure that no other family would have to endure what his had been through. Months passed, and the Justice Reform Initiative began to make real progress. Cases were reopened, unjust sentences were overturned, and people who had once felt powerless found their voices. The movement became a symbol of hope, a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of the most daunting challenges. Mary's story was no longer just her own. It had become a beacon for others, a testament to the power of perseverance, love, and community. One evening, as the sun set over their neighborhood, Mary and John stood together on their front porch, watching their children play in the yard. The laughter of Michael, Lisa, and Sam filled the air, a sound that made Mary's heart swell with joy. John took her hand, and she looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We're just getting started," she said softly, a smile spreading across her face. John nodded, his heart full. "Together," he replied. And in that moment, they knew that their fight for justice was far from over, but they were ready for whatever lay ahead, because they had each other, their family, and a community that believed in them. Thank you for staying with us through this incredible journey. If you believe in the power of change and the strength of community, please like, share, and comment below. What inspires you to fight for justice? Let us know, and join us as we continue to share stories that remind us of the power of love, resilience, and hope. Months later, Judge Wallace was formally removed from his position, his years of discrimination exposed for all to see. The investigation had uncovered more than anyone could have imagined. His bias had ruined countless lives, but now, the truth was out. The people who had suffered under his rulings finally had a voice, and their stories made it impossible for him to remain on the bench. Mary and John stood together as a united front, their family stronger than ever. The reforms they had pushed for were starting to take effect, and for the first time in a long while, people across the city felt hopeful. They saw change happening, and they knew it had come from a community that refused to stay silent. The Justice Reform Initiative was gaining momentum, and families who had once felt powerless were now finding the courage to speak up. As the sun set on their city one evening, Mary stood on the steps of the courthouse, her heart full as she looked out at the crowd of supporters gathered below. She raised the microphone to her lips, her voice strong and clear. "We're not finished yet," she said, her eyes sweeping over the faces before her. "But today, we've taken a big step forward. Justice is for everyone, and we'll keep fighting until it truly is." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing off the courthouse walls. Mary could feel the strength of their belief, their shared determination. It was a reminder that they were never alone, that even in the face of the darkest injustice, they had each other. John stepped up beside her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. He looked at the faces of their children standing in the front row, their smiles radiant. They had fought for this moment, and they knew the work was far from over. But standing there, under the fading light of the sun, they felt the power of unity, the power of a community that had come together to make things right. Thank you so much for watching and listening to this story. Remember, real change starts with each of us. What would you have done in Mary's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, And don't forget to like and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more stories that inspire us to make the world a better place. If you have a story you'd like us to tell, please share it with us, either by email or in the comments. Together, we can shine a light on injustice and make a difference.